Before jumping into this video, I want to mention up front to anyone currently watching, but particularly to Christadelphians, I'm always more than happy to discuss biblical matters with you or answer any questions you might have about my theological positions. Positions which, I'll grant, might seem as crazy to you as yours do to me. So please feel free to open a discussion in the comments, let me know what you think. Ask the obvious questions that are on your mind that I clearly haven't thought of. If you want to stay anonymous, create an anonymous account, I don't care. And if you prefer not to discuss in public, I've put my email address in the description. You can contact me at any time and I'll try to get back to you within a week. At this stage, I'd actually prefer to be doing more of that than speaking into a microphone, but I think this does serve a good purpose as well. So, somewhat reluctantly, here I am back again, but it's good to be here. Psalm 110, as I've said many times, is a big deal. It's a big deal to me, in particular, because it's one of the number one reasons I am where I am today. It's a big deal to the Christian faith because it tells us what Christ is doing at the moment. And I think verse 1 of this psalm is God's favourite Bible verse, because you can hardly read a chapter of the New Testament without tripping over it. It's all over the place. I think it actually is the most cited verse in the New Testament. So in a lot of ways, by tackling Psalm 110, we really are going to the meat of theology. This isn't a side issue. Whatever Psalm 110 says, God clearly wanted us to hear it and hear it over and over again. The problem with things like this, things that are a big deal, things that are ubiquitous, things that tap you on the shoulder and pull at your coat sleeve every time you try to forget them, is that you can become numb to them and you don't notice them. It reminds me of that invisible gorilla experiment where the participants watch a video of people passing basketballs to each other, and they're asked to count how many passes were made by one of the teams. And while they're focused on counting that, a person in a gorilla suit walks through the scene, pauses in the middle, beats his chest, and then walks off. And then at the end, they're asked, well, what did you think of the gorilla? And it turns out about half of them didn't even notice it. Well, Psalm 110 in the New Testament, I think, is like a pink gorilla doing breakdancing on stilts. And still, it seems, some people don't notice it, or at least give it much attention, sometimes because they're too busy counting up the haruspical entrails of various end times prophecies. So in this video, if you'll excuse the metaphor, we're going to be observing the gorilla in its natural habitat. We're going to be marveling at its stilts and appreciating its wonderful moves. And I can assure you, it's got some moves, much better than ray gun. Here's one of them. If you've ever heard of chiasms, this is kind of like that, although not really, because a chiasm strictly has an inverted parallelism, or mirror symmetry, where you go A, B, C, B, A. This one has more of a straightforward symmetrical structure, where you go A, B, C, with a central point in the middle of those. And if that made no sense to you at all, then I hope you'll feel satisfied by my assurance that there's a bunch of cool Hebrew stuff going on in the text of Psalm 110 that you don't notice at first glance. Now, if you aren't familiar with the psalm, this is where I'd recommend you pause the video and give it a thorough read-through so you know what's in it, so that when I talk about it in this video, you're kind of familiar with it. Because now I'm going to go through the psalm, section by section, explaining what it means. In sections A and A prime, we see the messianic figure enthroned at the right hand of God. Verse 1 says, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And verse 5a says, the Lord is at your right hand. Now, first of all, it's worth noting that, yes, David is talking about the enthronement and reign of the Messiah King here. It was sung as a promise that he would sit on his throne at the right hand of God and would have victory over his enemies whilst on that throne. And so when we apply this to Christ, clearly Christ is right now sitting in heaven at the right hand of God as king. He's reigning now, and we sort of established that in the last video. But another thing we can prove by the parallelism between sections A and A prime is that you can't just chop up the psalm and say, well, verse 1 is talking about Christ in heaven, but the rest of the psalm is referring to his reign on earth. That just won't work because, of course, verse 5 reiterates that the Lord is still at your right hand. So the whole psalm is about what would happen during the Lord's reign at the right hand of God. That's simply what the psalm is about. In sections B and B prime, we get a further indication of this. It says, Christ will be at the right hand of God until he puts his enemies as a footstool for his feet. Or as verse 5b says, he will crush kings in the day of his anger. And can you see how putting enemies under your feet, section B, is a very similar idea to crushing kings, section B prime. It's the same idea because you generally crush something by giving it a good stomp under the heel of your boot. So the explicit teaching of these verses is that Christ would be enthroned as king in heaven until his enemies have been made a footstool for his feet. Now, I've heard an objection to this from several Christadelphian friends and family, based on the fact that in Hebrew, the word make is in the imperfect tense in Hebrew. They argue that this means the footstool making is a process that begins while Christ is in heaven, but it's only completed after he returns to earth. There's about 47 different problems with this, but let's just look at a few. Problem 1, this simply destroys the imagery of the verse. The whole idea of a footstool is that you use it while you're sitting down. So if Christ gets up from his seat and returns to earth, which, by the way, is the place of God's footstool in Isaiah 66 verse 1, and only then after he returns is the majority of his footstool created, once he's stood up, then the image of the verse is simply nonsensical. What's the point of him sitting with a footstool if he's not sitting? Problem 2, there are many places where this exact Hebrew construction is used, where you have the word until coupled with an imperfect verb. And let me just show you a few of them and see what you think. Leviticus 22 verse 4, he shall not eat of the holy things until he is clean. Clean here is in the imperfect tense. So can he be partially clean when he eats of the holy things? Well, no, he can't. He has to do what verse 6 says, bathe himself in water and wait until evening, and then he can be clean and eat of the holy things. Joshua 10 verse 13, the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. In this verse, avenged is in the imperfect tense. So did the people keep fighting until they had only partially avenged themselves? Psalm 57 verse 1 says, in the shadow of your wings will I make my refuge until these calamities have passed over. Past is, again, in the imperfect tense. So was the psalmist waiting until just some of the calamities had passed, or all of them? So let's be clear about something. The obvious meaning of the phrase, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, remains the obvious meaning of the phrase, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And no amount of Hebrew gymnastics can get you out of that. Problem 3, the New Testament doesn't interpret it that way. If we just look at one example, Hebrews 10 verse 12 to 13, it says, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. Now, if you're tracking with the argument of Hebrews when these verses come up, his meaning couldn't be clearer, because he's basically saying Christ offered a single sacrifice for sins, and now he's in heaven expecting the outworking of that sacrifice on earth. That's how his enemies are made his footstool, through the effect of his sacrifice. And the whole point of Hebrews is that this sacrifice is made efficacious by his presence in heaven as our intercessor. If he goes back to earth, he's no longer our intercessor, and the footstool making won't happen. That's the argument of Hebrews. And just by the way, the word waiting in that verse, in Greek, it's not a passive word at all. He's not just sitting around waiting. It simply means eagerly expecting. That's what the word means. And I think that's actually how the King James Version translates it. So if you're tracking with the argument of Hebrews, this quotation from Psalm 110 verse 1, it only makes sense if you allow for the footstool to be created while Christ is in heaven as an intercessor. Now for sections C and C prime. These are sections where we see exactly how the Lord's enemies are made his footstool. It says, Yahweh will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, have dominion in the midst of your enemies. Now, as we established in the previous video from Psalm 68, under the new covenant, Zion is not a literal mountain. It's the place where God dwells, which is in heaven. And since Ephesians 1 says that the church is currently in heavenly places with Christ, the church is also identified as Zion in the New Testament. So just take Hebrews 12, for example. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire, and darkness, and gloom, and a tempest, but you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, etc. Now notice that Mount Zion, in this section, is contrasted to a mountain that could be touched, which was Mount Sinai in the Old Covenant. The believers in the New Covenant will never be gathered to a literal Mount Sinai. unlike what Christadelphians teach. Right here in these verses, it says, we've already come to our mountain, and it's Mount Zion, a mountain that cannot be touched, because it's a heavenly city made up of angels in heaven, and the church which is enrolled in heaven. That's what Mount Zion is in its fulfillment. So when Psalm 110 says, Yahweh will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, we're supposed to think of Acts chapter 2 and Pentecost, which is the antitype of when Israel gathered at Mount Sinai in the Old Testament. You'll remember, for example, that when the law of Moses was given at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, the people ended up making a golden calf, which was a silly thing to do because it got 3,000 of them killed. You can read about that in Exodus 32. But in Acts chapter 2, when the gospel was given, 3,000 people were baptized. So when the law was given, 3,000 died for disobedience. When the gospel was given, 3,000 died in Christ in obedience. They were buried with him in baptism. The former took place at a literal Mount Sinai. The latter took place at a spiritual Mount Zion. So then how is it that Christ makes his enemies his footstool? It's not through a literal sword. It's through the spiritual death of conversion to the gospel. Christ's scepter is going out from Zion, and it will be successful in its mission. In verse 6, we read the parallel section. It says, he will render justice among the nations, and that's fairly straightforward. It also says, he will fill them with corpses. He will crush the head that is over the wide earth. Now, let's be clear about something. When this psalm was sung in Old Testament times, they were singing about the kings of Israel who went out to war, like David, and conquered all their enemies and filled the land with corpses. But we've already established that the New Covenant uses a more effective sword. It's a sword that kills the old man and gives life to a new. And that's because God's purpose isn't to fill all the nations with literal corpses. His purpose is to convert the nations. Sections D and D prime. Now, there's a lot of symbolism in these sections, which I'll briefly explain. It says, your people will offer themselves freely in the day of your power. Now, of course, it's very clear in the New Testament that the day of Christ's power was his ascension to heaven. You remember in the book of Acts, for example, he tells his disciples, who were his people who were offering themselves willingly, by the way, he tells them that they would receive power when the Holy Spirit came upon them. And then in Acts chapter 2, Peter explains that the reason he could distribute that power on them was because he had ascended to heaven. And then he quotes Psalm 110 to prove it. So the day of Christ's power was undeniably, according to the New Testament, his ascension to heaven. Now, when it talks about in the splendor of holiness from the womb of the dawn, if the dawn has a womb, then it means the dawn is giving birth to something. The new day is producing something. Now, if you look at the first chapter of Luke, when Jesus was born, it talks about the sunrise visiting us from on high, talking about Christ. So that's when the sun came up. It's when Jesus was born. So what Psalm 110 is talking about is a new day, a new order of things, which was certainly set in motion by the coming of Christ, and particularly his ascension to heaven, when his new kingdom and kingship came into fruition. The dew of youthfulness is another interesting phrase, and without going into detail, I believe this refers to Christians who are always fresh and vigorous in their efforts to serve Christ, the people that are willing, the people that give themselves freely. At the other end of the chapter, we have a recapitulation of this idea. First, Christ drinks from the brook by the wayside, and then because he does that, therefore his head will be lifted up. You'll notice that in the text. And this may seem like a weird statement until we recall Paul's words in Philippians 2. He says that Christ was prepared to humble himself to become a man, and therefore God has highly exalted him. Right? He's lifted up his head. The same man who got thirsty and drank water from brooks on earth is the same man who was exalted far above all the heavens because of his humility. Which leaves us with the last section, section E. It says, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, you'll remember that a priest after the order of Melchizedek is a priest who is also a king. That's what a Melchizedek priest is. It's a king priest. So whenever it was that Christ was made a Melchizedek priest, he must also have been made a Melchizedek king at that time also. Do you see where I'm going with this? You see, the book of Hebrews is clear that Christ was made a Melchizedek priest when he ascended to heaven. In fact, it quotes this verse from Psalm 110 to prove it. And the book of Hebrews is just as clear that Christ can only be an effective Melchizedek priest because he's in heaven. If he was on earth, he couldn't be a priest. Hebrews 8 verse 1 to 4. It says, "Now the main point in what is being said is this: we have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the holy places and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man." Talking about heaven, by the way. He went to heaven. And then it says in verse 4, "Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law." So let's just put all these three pieces together. We have a Melchizedek is both a priest and a king, and he became a Melchizedek priest when he ascended to heaven, and he can't be a priest if he's on earth. Now here's the point. If he became a Melchizedek priest when he ascended to heaven, then he also became a Melchizedek king when he ascended to heaven. And if he can't be a Melchizedek priest on earth, then he can't be a Melchizedek king on earth either. So that's postmillennialism in one psalm. In the next video, we'll go into the practical implications of this, as in what we should do, and why it is that these doctrines get me out of bed in the morning, and why it is that they should get you out of bed in the morning too.